Thank you very, very much, Mr. Moore. Thank you, Mr. Polici. Appreciated your reading, and greetings to all of you and to those of you that are attending with us via the electronic media. Let's turn to 2 Samuel 15 today to begin services, and I kind of want to talk to you about a movie. It isn't very often I can recommend a movie to you, but this one is one I would like to recommend today. It was released in 2009 and starred Richard Gere. It was based on a true story, and the name of it is Hachiko, A Story of a Dog. And it's a very moving story. And the movie starts out like this. There's a classroom, and the children that are in it are given an assignment to give a speech on who their hero is. And the movie starts out with this girl giving her speech, and she talks about her hero, and she writes his name on the board, and it's Columbus. And she says, well, my hero is Columbus because he discovered America, and we have a holiday and don't have to go to school on that day. And that's why he's my hero. And then the next boy gets up, and he writes the name Hachi on the board. And he turns around and he says, Hachi is my hero. It's my grandfather's dog. And everybody in the class starts laughing at him. And he says, let me tell you the story. And he begins to explain how there was an Akita puppy that was sent from Japan to the States. And somehow the shipping label had come off of his cage. And then once, when the train lurched, his cage slipped and the door opened. And he got out when the train stopped. And he's walking along, looking around at the train station, and he runs into Richard Gere, who's a professor who teaches music at the university. And Richard Gere picks him up and says, what a cute little dog. And he takes the dog and he takes him to the station manager, and he says, I'd like you to take care of this dog. I found him, and maybe the owner will come and get him. And the guy says, I can't keep that dog. And so he leaves his name and address, and he goes home. He doesn't tell his wife he brought this dog home because she isn't like that interested in the dog. And so he puts the dog in another room, and he goes in, and the next thing you know, the dog has nudged the door open, and she's up in bed, and he's licking her feet. And she screams. She's so upset. And so anyway, she wants him to get rid of this dog. And so they try to send out flyers looking for the family that owned the dog, and they don't get any responses. And so then they went ahead and put out flyers that there's a Akita, a very fine dog that is free to any good home. And she gets a call from somebody who was interested in the dog. And at the same time, her daughter had come to visit, and she looks out the window as she's talking to this family who wants the dog, and she sees her husband with a ball in his mouth. He's trying to show the Akita how to fetch. And the daughter's taking pictures, and they're laughing, and they're just having a wonderful family moment. And she says to the people on the phone, I think we found a home already. And so she decides to keep the dog. And as the dog grows, it gets bigger and bigger, and then one day it's big enough it digs a hole under the fence when Richard Gere, the professor, goes to the train station in the morning to go to work. And he meets him along the way and follows him, and they have a good time playing back and forth, and then he goes into the train station, he tells the dog, go on home. The dog goes home. And then as he gets bigger, he goes back and fills the hole and everything and says, you can't do this anymore. But then the dog is a little older now, and he jumps the fence, and he follows the professor to the train station every single day. And then he goes home after he goes into the train station. And then at exactly the right time, he suddenly gets up, dives over the fence, goes to the train station, and he waits. And he waits in this one spot every day until he sees his master coming out of the door. And he runs up to him, and they hug, and he licks him, and they have this great time together. And so there's one day that he's starting to go to work, and now it's just become a daily routine. And he's starting to go to work, and the dog starts barking at him and barking at him. And he goes with him about halfway there, and then the dog turns around and runs back home and gets the ball and takes the ball to him. And he reaches him when he's at the train station, and the dog throws the ball. And he says, "Hey, you're learning how to fetch. That's so great." And he throws the ball, and the dog gets the ball and brings it back. Well, he had talked to this Japanese expert on these dogs, and he said, these dogs they're not people pleasers like other dogs, the Akitas. They aren't going to ever fetch. And the reason is because they just lock on to one person, and they are loyal to that one person. And that's what the dog had done. But the dog knew something was wrong that the man didn't know. And he was trying to keep him home. So the man goes to work. Richard Greer, the professor, goes to class that day, and he keels over from a brain aneurysm, and he dies that day. They have the funeral, and the wife sells the home. Well, she gives the dog to her daughter, and the dog, they have a gated fence, and the dog just sits there every day in front of that gated fence. And, you know, he tries numerous times to make escapes, and they bring him back. But finally, she says, "You know, you don't want to stay. You want to go, don't you?" And she says, "You can stay here if you want. We'll take care of you. But if you want to go and you have to go, you can." So she opens the gate to see what the dog does. And the dog heads out. And he goes back to his home. But some other people are living in it now. And he goes into the home, and he's going back to see the owner. And then these guys come out and say, "Hey, look, here's our first visitors." And the dog goes, "Nope, he's not here." So he goes to the tracks, finds the railroad station, and there he sleeps that night under an empty railroad car. And the next day, he goes back to that one spot, and he waits for his master to come back. And he does this day after day. Well, pretty soon the hot dog man and the grocery store guy and the butcher, they're giving him little pieces of meat and stuff and feeding him and befriending him. Every day he does this. Every single day for 9 years. For 9 years, that dog went back, sat on that one spot, until finally the dog died in that spot, waiting for its master. And the city was so impressed with this that they built a statue of the dog in that very location that stands there to this very day because of the loyalty. And the boy who was giving the story, he says to the class, which is now completely silent, he says to the class, "That dog, Hachi, taught me more about loyalty than any other human being ever on this earth." And I was in tears in the movie because I could see that kind of loyalty is the kind of loyalty that we should have. And so many times we don't have the kind of loyalty. And so I ask us today, that is, that we should have, you know. And I ask us today, where does our loyalty lie today? Is our loyalty to ourselves, or is it to anybody else other than ourselves? Are we a people that even have loyalty today in the world that we live in, that is so seemingly self-centered? Are we loyal to those who are close to us? Are we loyal to our master, is my question, of course, today. I ask you to think about this for a minute, because in the past, you know, people would often take a job with an employer, and they would work their entire life for that employer. And today, 25% of all employees switch jobs. That's what the current statistic is. Even in this weak economy, 25% of people are switching jobs in order to build a portfolio. They get a job, build their portfolio, get their experience, and then they want to go ratchet and leverage up and get a position somewhere else where they get a higher compensation, you know. But there is never, it seems, loyalty to the company that they work for. And you know what else? The reverse is also true, because I've worked for companies in which the company, when I finally left, they would work with somebody for years. And then somebody would come along, another business that was their supplier would come along, and they'd offer them a cheaper price. They'd go with them for the cheaper price. They wouldn't go back and say, can you negotiate this? You know, we've been friends for a long time. We've done business for a long time. Can you match this some way? Can we work a deal? They just drop a company in minutes if there was more money to be made. And then, haven't you seen it where companies today, because there's an economic crunch or a recession or something, they will lay off employees that have been faithful for 20 years before they get their retirement. They'll lay them off because, well, it's a business economy, they call it. That is, the businesses have the advantage today and they can dismiss people in order to save themselves money. And they'll drop people, and it's because only money matters. And today they say, every man has their price, don't they? And that's really true. You know, in March of this year, a Chicago man sold his wife on Craigslist for sexual pleasures for anyone who wanted her. And he threatened her that if she didn't do it, she would never see her kids again. He'd take them from her and disappear, and she'd never see them. And so that's what he did. Pakistan, a woman had her husband sell her kidney, and she didn't know it till she went to the doctor with this pain, and he reveals, you're missing a kidney. So he had someone come put her out, incise her, take out the kidney, and he sold it so he could get a tractor. You know? I mean, this is the world we live in. This is how people think in many cases around the world today. And so I want you to think about this in terms, for a minute, of King David's experience. You know, he had a son, Ammon, and he loved Tamar, who was Absalom's sister. Of course, he had a number of sons and daughters from different women because he had more than one wife. Finally, Ammon seemed to love her so much that he conspired a way to bring her in to take care of him. He pretended illness, and there he raped her. But after he raped her, he hated her more than he loved her, and he wouldn't take her to be his. So he had to run for protection. He was in exile for 3 years for that. Finally, David repented and said, you know, I'll forgive you, and he allowed Absalom to come back. But then Absalom began a political move of pretending he was really friends with all the people, and he loved the people, you know, kind of like politicians do today, that we're on the side of the people so that he would be loved by them. And then he instigated a rebellion against David himself, as you remember this. Now, he knew a man named Ahithophel, who was also related, by the way, to Bathsheba. And this was David's counselor, and he was a very wise man, but he enlisted him in his betrayal in 2 Samuel 15 and in verse 12. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, and David's counselor from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom because, you know, he's for the people. And David and his household then began to flee. And there came a messenger to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword. Now, I don't believe that he fled simply out of fear, but I think he fled because he had loyalty to the kingdom. That is, he was the one, as you remember, who faced Goliath, and he had no fear. This was a man who was really fearless when it came to himself, but he didn't want his servants to be killed. He didn't want the nation to be divided. And so in verse 15, the king's servants said unto the king, Behold, your servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king appoints. Think about that. These guys knew their life was in danger. They knew that they could lose any position, any income, any good life, any of the pleasures that they were used to, and yet they so admired David and so loved him that they were willing to follow him even under these circumstances. They had a real loyalty to him because there was nothing in it for them. Then in verse 16, the king went forth and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women which were concubines to keep the house. And the king went forth and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was far off. And all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Chetherites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. Then David stops one guy and has something to say to him, one of the men that was there, and he did something very interesting to me, and something transpired here that is worth noting. Then said the king to Ittai, the Gittite, Wherefore go you with us? Why are you going with us? Return to your place and abide with the king, for you're a stranger and also an exile. And so it says, Whereas you came but yesterday, should I this day make you go up and down with us? Seeing I go where I may, return now, and take back your brethren, mercy and truth be with you. And here's what Ittai, or Ai, answered the king and said, As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, wherever in death or life, even there also will thy servant be. Well, David says, or at least in the King James it says, you came but yesterday. And he didn't mean yesterday, but what he meant was you came along, along in the past. You came, and he was a, what do they call him, mercenary. That was a soldier that would fight for whatever king would pay him the best. And so he had no alliances with anybody. That was the nature of the game he was in and the trade he was in. But he had come to love David so much that he was so loyal to him, he was willing to go even to his death. And he brought his family with him to follow the king. And I think this is important. And David said unto him, in verse 22, David said to Ittai, Go and pass over. And the Gittite passed over, and all his men and all the little ones that were with him. David then, I think, had to think about this some. And anyway, it says, All the country wept with a loud voice in verse 23. And then down in 26, it says this, But if he say, I have no delight in thee. Anyway, the king said to Zadok, Carry back the ark to the city. And then in 26, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he'll bring me again and show me both it and his habitation. But if he says thus, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am, let him do to me as seems good to him. And so my point in reading this is this, that David was loyal and remained loyal to God, even though he made mistakes. So first I want to talk about the mistake, because it was brought up today about Bernie Madoff's son, who was found having hung himself. He couldn't get a job. He was ostracized because of his name and who he was associated with. And he killed himself, and he killed himself in the home where his child was. And so Annie made this point about this, in which she said that, we aren't able to look into the future to see the effects of our sins. And I've experienced this, and I think you've all experienced it too, that we don't always know how things will turn out. And that's why God, in his wisdom, gives us his law and his way. And we don't always understand why it's so important. And we may break it, and then we discover later there are severe consequences that we never imagined would ever happen. And this is the point, that David was loyal to God, and he was willing to accept whatever punishment came his way because he knew he had sinned and deserved it. So if God was with him, fine. But if not, then he would accept that, and whatever the Lord's will was, he was going to do, because he now learned this lesson. God's will is always the right thing to do, no matter what. And we may not realize the future and what it's going to cost. But in this case, it cost a great deal. God had said the sword would never leave his household because of his sin. And he didn't know that when he first did it. But here he was fighting his own son who he loved, and he just grieved terribly for this. So anyway, my point is this, at this particular juncture of the sermon, I have seen people who did not do what David did. I've seen people who left God for so much lesser of a reason because they didn't get what they wanted in life, because they weren't ordained and someone else was, because they had to go through some sort of trial, you know. They weren't blessed the way they expected. These kinds of things have caused people to leave God and leave the truth of God instead of having that kind of loyalty that David showed in his experience. So David remained loyal to God, and so should we. You know, this is true loyalty. When we do what we do, even though no one owes us any allegiance, there's not going to be any benefit to us, there's no conditions attached, and yet we do the right thing. And that is when we are exhibiting true loyalty. Remember Peter, before he was converted? He said he loved Christ. I believe he did, but it was with a carnal love. And he said, you know, my allegiance is with you. I'll even die for you. And then when his life was threatened, he fled in the sense that he denied Christ 3 times. All of the apostles actually fled at one time. And I say, this is exactly how human nature works in us. We flee when something is no longer to our advantage. We will flee that situation. That's the tendency of human nature. But I want us to consider today our Creator and our Savior, who was magnificent and glorious in his throne, ruling over the universe, and he gave up his beauty, and he gave up his majesty, and he gave up his power, and he became a little baby, unable to even control his own bowel movements, if you will. And he became a child, and then he grew up being mocked by other children because he had no father. And then later, as a man, he was leading people, and they said, well, we want you to be a king. He's performing miracles. He's doing good for others and performing these miracles. They say, well, we want you to be our king. And because he refuses, they reject him. They didn't get their way. They reject him. Later on, they cry out, crucify him. Crucify him. And then he goes to the Roman lictor, who was a professional centurion who was trained in flogging, who would flog a person to the near death. And so he would take him to the point where he'd watch his breathing, and when his breathing was just ready to stop, only then would he stop. And if they went unconscious because of the beating, they'd throw water on him and wake him back up and then continue the beating on and on and on. And he went through that until his ribs were bare and the flesh was torn off of him. Then he's nailed to a stake and it's dropped into a hole, and you can imagine him shuddering with that kind of pain that as those nails dug into his skin. And finally, the Savior and the Creator of mankind died forsaken. And that's the kind of loyalty he had for you and for me. that he was willing to do that for us. That's the kind of loyalty he had to the Father. Hey, is there any other way? Is there any other way? Okay, then, your will be done, no matter what happens to me. That is an enormous kind of loyalty. And so, all he did for us was when we didn't deserve it. Let's go to 1 John. 1 John. And we claim that he is the God that we worship. We claim loyalty and allegiance to him today. But I ask us, how loyal are we? How loyal to him are we? Read 1 John 2 and verse 3, because it says, hereby we do know that we know him if we keep his commandments. He that says, I know him, and keeps not his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly is the love of God perfected. Or you could say the loyalty of God perfected. Loyalty to God is perfected. Hereby know we that we're in him. He that says he abides in him ought himself also to walk even as he walked. Man, think about that. Really think about it for a minute. We're to walk as he walked. We're to live by the same code he lived by. We are to be men and women who exhibit that kind of loyalty in return to him. And we do that by our continued faithfulness to his way of life. And we are the people who should be saying, when we've done what we were commanded to do, we didn't do anything big. It was just our duty. That's all it was, just our duty. And he should be always the object of our devotion. He should be the one we are completely devoted to and committed to, and this should be evidenced in our lives. Steadfast in following him. That's the kind of loyalty we should have. And I think of Hachi, the dog, every day for 9 years, over and over, the same exact behavior. You know, I ask you today to digress for a minute. Let's think about the loyalty that we should have to our mates. 1 Corinthians 10, if you will. 1 Corinthians 10. Just a short verse I want to pick up there. You know, God says that in marriage the two are to become one, but I'm convinced that this means much more than just physically. I believe that we are to mirror the relationship of Christ and the Father. I believe that we are to mirror the relationship of Christ and the church, you know. And we should have an intimacy that absolutely cannot be broken no matter what happens, you know. And the problems that come in life are not or should not be looked at as difficulties or trials, in the sense they really are means for us to draw together and have a common mind in how to solve them. You understand what I mean by that? So that we start to develop a singleness of mind and a singleness in our actions in the way we deal with things. And Paul makes it clear when he talks about it. We know these scriptures, and so I don't have to turn there, that, you know, the husband's to love the wife as Christ loved the church and give himself for it. The wife is to submit to the husband. And then he says, I speak in a mystery about Christ and the church. That's the relationship that we are to have in marriage with one another, you know. But there are over 50% of the marriages that exist today that break up. They don't have the loyalty to keep going. I remember an article I read years ago about marriages that lasted over 30 years, 25 or 30-year-long marriages, and they wanted to find out what the common factor was in that marriage, and they looked and they looked and they studied over a period of a long number of, a couple of decades. They actually made this study, and when they concluded it, they said there was only one single common element in those marriages that were long-lasting, and that element was commitment. That's what it was. They were loyal to each other. That's all it was. And they gave an example of one man that said, you know, after about 7 years I was married, and all of a sudden I went to my wife and I said, you know, I just don't feel about you the way I used to feel. I don't feel like I love you anymore. And they said, well, you know, we said we would stay together, and so, you know, we committed to one another, and so we're going to stay together and make this work. And, you know, as time went on, he came to love her more and more. And then about 14 years into it, she comes to him and says, you know, I just don't feel about you the way I used to feel. And then he's kind of broken up by this and shocked. And then, you know, they said, well, but we committed to keep together, and so we're going to stay together and try to work on it and make it work. And after 20 years, they were in love more than they ever were before, and they just grew to love together as they grew together and dealt with the difficulties and dealt with the problems and developed a singleness of mind. And nobody else understood them the way they did. Nobody else could ever be better, you understand? But it always comes back to this issue of loyalty, loyalty to our commitments and so on. So anyway, I read some books, a number of books on marriage and stuff, and you know, there are different views, and a lot of people express that there is no one single problem in marriage that people have, that there's a variety of problems, and almost everyone seems to think that the big issue about marriage and the difficulty is not enough communication. And I can certainly tell you that communication can destroy a marriage, because I remember some of the names I was called. You know, communication isn't the problem. There is one single problem. I'm convinced of this with my whole being. There is one single problem in marriage, and the problem is this: selfishness. That's what the problem in marriage always is. Everybody that I've ever seen, and I've counseled people for marriage a number of times, the guy meets a girl and he thinks this girl can satisfy his needs. The girl meets a guy and says, I think this guy can satisfy my needs, and they're marrying the other person to satisfy their needs. They are not marrying them in order to try to satisfy their needs. They're not thinking, you know, how much can I give this other person? They're really thinking, what am I going to get out of this? They're not seeking the other's welfare, but what provides the individual. What they want is security, they want companionship, they want sex, they want affection, they want something from the other person they think they can get. And that's why they go into the contract of marriage. But it's so often loyalty to the self. And we're still in that gimme, gimme stage. You know how little kids are? Gimme, gimme. They want that toy that they see the other one has. They want to take it. That's how we are, even as grown-ups. It's human nature in us. We want it. We want what we want. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 24 says this. Am I sure about that? 10:24. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. But the word wealth isn't really in there. That's added in italics. In other words, don't seek your own, but seek what another needs, is the way it should read. Seek what the other one needs, and that's the advice God gives to us. And so the loyalty that God wants in marriage is for us to give and put the other one first. Think about it. Marriage is really designed for the perfect relationship to help you overcome human nature, because your mate holds a mirror up to you. And sometimes you look in that mirror and you go, man, I don't look so good. You know, I could use a little remodel here, you know. And it's not that you should be threatened by it and argue back, but take a good look. Take a good look at what am I giving, and what is our relationship like. Ephesians 6, if you will, Ephesians 6. I want to next consider our relationship toward our children. You know, I want you to consider loyalty in that regard. So many families today have the situation where both parents have to work. And so many marriages end in divorce, and then so many other people don't even marry, but they still raise children at the same time. And as a result of this, there's so little loyalty to the children. And I remember when I went to college that I was managing apartments so I would be able to have rent-free. And when I managed those apartments, I would watch the families, and the kids would come home from school, and they would open the door, go in the door, close the door, and I would see the flicker of the television. That was who was taking care of those kids. And they called them in our society latchkey kids. They were alone. And they say that about, most families, they get 15 minutes of time with their kids today. And I think you were talking about, Terry, going to L.A. and seeing cases where families were doing really well, and everybody's expected to do really well out there. And people were working so hard, they had very little time to spend with their children, really, because most of it was traveling to pick them up, take them to school, and the rest was cooking dinner and getting things ready, and very little time spent with the children. But I say again, the latchkey kids are the lucky ones. They are the lucky ones. The Department of Health and Human Services stated that for the year 2007, 794,000 children were the victims of abuse or neglect that year. Think about that. Child Protective Services states this: we get 3.2 million referral calls alleging maltreatment of children every year. They state these calls involve, of course, more than one child in a family. 5.8 million children in America per year, they get calls from people reporting them. You'd think that people would naturally be loyal to their children, but God tells us, don't discourage them. You understand? There's got to be a loyalty to them, a real concern for their welfare. And I've seen parents in stores and in a mobile home park I was in once, I saw this, where the parents are actually calling their children names, thinking it's going to help them get them to behave instead of ever showing them love, It's really amazing. There is to be a bond of love in the family. Ephesians 6:1. It reminds us of the commandment, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, but that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. But then it says something to the head of the household. You fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And yet many fathers will strike out in anger. They'll just say no, in so many cases that their children become castaways or as runaways in many cases. Thousands and thousands of runaways because of the abuse they suffer exist. They become street children, and they live in tunnels and parks and places like that because there is no loyalty to those children. Some parents look at them just as problems they have to deal with. And I say this, man, today, when I went to school, I thought it was hard. I thought there were a lot of problems. I moved around a lot and had to fight the tough kids and all that. And I thought, this is hard being young. And then, I'm telling you today, I would not want to grow up as a young person with all the drugs and music and all of the attitude that's out there that you see in the way they dress and the way they're pierced and everything. And so I say to us in the Church of God, let's show loyalty and consistency and affection to our children. Yeah, we've got to be the right example to them. And that's why so many children did not go and stay in the church. You understand why they didn't stay in the church? Because of the hypocrisy that went on at home, made the religion look foolish and wrong. That's why they left. It didn't ring true because it wasn't true. And so we can correct them, and we should correct our children. We should train them and teach them. But everything we do with them needs to be done with affection and with love. 1 Peter 2. 1 Peter 2. And I want us to consider our responsibility as an employee. I remember several cases where I worked for companies, and when the boss was around, you know how the people work. They were so diligent. If there was nothing to do, they picked up a broom or they started dusting. They kept themselves busy whenever the boss was around. As soon as the boss left, they would start goofing off, joking around, goofing around, playing, and having a good time, you know. I went to Mr. Moore's graduation, and I was so incredibly impressed there. And the reason was they had all the graduates stand up, and they turned around and faced the audience, and there they made a pledge to take the best possible care of those patients and put their welfare first. And I went, wow, that was so beautiful. I mean, I kind of teared up when I saw them do that. I thought, wow, what a beautiful commitment. You know, then I began to hear stories of nurses who sit around and read magazines. I heard a story of a nurse that let somebody bleed from their ears for 3 days before anything was done. I've heard of nurses that will ignore the severely ill or terminally ill as if they don't really exist, because, well, we can't help them. Can you imagine this? What happens to them? What happens to that loyalty? They lose it. And that's my point. Loyalty in life is so important and so valuable in every single case. Now, those people, I believe, that do that are not true believers. But nonetheless, the world's filled with them out in the workplace. You understand? And their attitudes can rub off on us. And I'm saying, don't let it. Don't let that attitude rub off on us. We've got to show loyalty to Jesus Christ. We've got to show loyalty to our nation, to our employers, and to the people that we serve in our life. You understand, as it says, we don't really work for ourselves, do we? We don't really work for our boss or our employer. We work for Jesus Christ. And I say, in whatever we do, even cutting the lawn, you understand, we should be working for Him. Everything should exhibit a kind of quality that reflects His way of life. Okay, 1 Peter 2 and verse 9. You're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation, a particular, unusual, unique people, that you should show forth the praises of Him that's called you out of darkness into His marvelous light, which in times past you weren't a people, but now you are the people of God, and you did not obtain mercy in the past, but now you have obtained His loyalty in the way and form of mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you, he writes, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against your own soul, your own life. And so here he is telling us, you've got to be a stranger and pilgrim. You can't let those attitudes of others affect you. You can't take an invested part in this world or that company because you belong to Christ. And so you're working for Him. You're just passing through, a stranger and a pilgrim. And that's what the Feast of Tabernacles teaches us yearly in part. Verse 12, having your conversation or your conduct honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God. When? Now? Oh no. They'll be fighting you now in the day of visitation, when He comes and when the true people of God are known. And it says in Malachi 3:16, then you'll know who served God and who didn't, because in the day of visitation it'll be revealed. And therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or to the governors, or to them that are sent by Him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of them that do well. For so it is that this is the will of God, that you be well-doing, and that well-doing put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And as free, not using your liberty as a cloak for maliciousness, but as the servants of God. And then it says to honor. Show respect to all men and women. Love the brotherhood. Fear God and honor the king. Servants, those who are employees, be subject to your masters or employers with all fear, not only in the good and gentle, but also the froward, or those that are troublesome to you. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience towards God endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it if when you're buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? But if when you do well and you suffer for it and you take it patiently, this is acceptable with God. Why? Because you are developing the mind of Christ. Your loyalty is to God. It doesn't matter if those people like you or don't like you. You're doing the best you can in every case. And your loyalty is to the God who created us and who saved us. For even hereunto were you called. This is the reason you were called, because Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. We're to walk in his steps. Who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled, reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but he committed himself to him that judges rightly. That's what we're to do. Be committed to the Father who always judges rightly. That's what he did, and we're to walk in his steps. And so we are to show loyalty to him in all cases, respectful to other people, work diligently, and strive for quality in everything we do, and strive to reflect Christ's character in everything we do. That's the kind of loyalty we should have. You know, it's been said that a friend in need is a friend indeed. Man, is that ever true? You know, during my brief time on this planet, I've found that people are often your friends when there's something they can receive from you, but they won't support you when you're down and out. And that happens over and over again, at least to me. Maybe it's my way, I don't know. but that's what I've experienced, you know. And I've even seen people who were my friends at some time later turn on me and be against me, talk negative about me to others. It's amazing how that can happen. I don't know how that flip switches, but you understand there's certainly a lack of loyalty there. Sometimes I reflect on the love that David and Jonathan shared. And it said it was a love even greater than that of women. And sometimes men can do that because they have the same kinds of mindsets, you know, the math science side, you know, the guns and cars side or whatever. But we can share things that, you know, that we can't always, our wives don't always relate to. And so you can have a friend that is really, really close. And they were so close that Jonathan was willing to protect David from his own father. That was loyalty to his friend. And so I want to go to Ruth, if you would, for a moment, because she too, to me, is an example of allegiance to one who was her friend and who she loved. Okay. As you remember her story, it was the story of Naomi, who had moved with her husband up into Moab, and she did this because of a famine in the land, but her husband died, and she had two sons, and the two sons had married two ladies that were Moabites, and one was Oprah, and the other was Ruth. Well, when the sons died, she told these girls to go back to their homeland, back to their gods and to their people and their mothers. And Oprah kissed her goodbye. However, Ruth had grown very close to her and had come to love her mother-in-law. And she had become a faithful friend to her. And she said, "I won't leave you alone." Now, I want you to think about this. It wasn't just that she liked being sidekicks. Ruth was an older woman, and she was going to stay with her to take care of her. That was the kind of love she had. That was the kind of loyalty she had. Ruth 1, verse 16. And Ruth said, entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I'm going to lodge. And your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where did you die? That's where I'm going to die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Ruth stayed with her, and she helped her every day. She gathered food for her, and she adopted the Almighty God as her God and lived according to His way. As a result, she was blessed, not just with the marriage to Boaz, who was a wealthy man, but she was blessed to be one of the line of the Savior Himself. But you'd have to understand, God's looking at the heart when these decisions are made. She had a heart of loyalty to Him and had a heart as a result of loyalty to Ruth, who was a good woman. And to me, this is like a beautiful example of true friendship. And this is what our friendship should be like, that we are family and we are brethren. And if any of us need something, I feel that we have an obligation to help one another, never abandoning friends when they fall on bad times. And don't leave them because they might make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. You have made mistakes and I've made mistakes. And we don't do that. We have a relationship that isn't about just us. It's not about just us, but it's about fidelity with others. Revelation 3, if you will. Revelation 3. That kind of faithfulness is real. That kind of faithfulness is, I think, so admirable that it should be copied by us in our lives. It is God-like to be that kind of loyal and that kind of faithful in all of these aspects. And it should be the relationship that you and I have primarily with our God. There should be an intense, passionate loyalty that is unfaltering and that will never fail. And even if we make mistakes, it's not our loyalty that failed. You understand, we come right back after the mistake and admit the mistake and back to being close to Him. You know, there was a young man once that confided this to a friend. He said, I never go out with another girl other than my girlfriend unless it's 50 miles away. So you understand the point? His loyalty went 50 miles. How far does our loyalty go with God? How far does it go? 50 miles? When no one's looking? You know, what are we really like? And how loyal are we to Him? How far does it extend? We're called to be children of God, aren't we? And we're called to marry Him one day. And we're also called to be His employees. That is, we are to do His work, aren't we? You understand my point. All of these relationships we have on earth are symptomatic or symbolic of the relationship that we're to have to Him. I want us to notice the aspects of a loyal church. And here we read in Revelation 3 and verse 7, and to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says He that is holy, He that is true, He that has the key of David, He that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens. I know your works. Behold, I've set before you an open door, and no man can shut it. Why? Because you've had a little strength. Well, what's that strength in? It's in keeping His word. Look at it. You've kept my word. You haven't denied my name. You know who I am. I'm not just something you say in your prayers. I'm real to you. I am somebody, and you fear me and love me. Behold, I'll make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they're Jews and are not, but do lie. Behold, I'll make them to come and worship before your feet, to know that I loved you. Because you've kept the word of my patience, that is, you've patiently kept my word. Now, when you do something patiently, what does it mean? It means there's opposition against doing it. And there's opposition against doing God's way in every corner of this planet today. It's in every TV show, it's in every magazine, it's in every radio program, it's in all the attitudes of the people we work with and associate with. It's everywhere. And we have a job of resisting that because of our loyalty to our Master. And that's why he's going to do this. And because you've kept the word of my patience, I will keep you from the hour of tribulation that shall come upon the world to try them that dwell on the earth. And he says this as a way of encouragement. Behold, I come quickly. Hold that fast that you have, that no man take your crown. He that overcomes, I'm going to make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. And I'll write upon him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven from my God. And I'll write upon him my new name. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Well, what's the Spirit saying to the churches? Be loyal in everything. Be faithful in everything. And keep my word. Have respect towards me. They're small but strong. Don't deny his name. They're loyal towards him. They patiently kept his word in the face of opposition to not do it. Faithful to him, and they don't compromise their integrity. We're his people. That's who we are. We're his people that he's called. And it's an honor and a privilege beyond anything anyone could ever imagine in this world. And we should know and love our Master and patiently keep our vigil waiting for him. And even if we die, like Hachiko did, waiting for his Master, even if we die waiting for our Master, it's the best thing that could ever happen to us. It is the best thing that could ever happen. So let's strive to be faithful to him to the end. Let's not put our own desires first all the time. There is, I think, a wonderful example in a dog, an unclean animal, in his loyalty to his Master. He was faithful to his Master, and I think it was an enormous and wonderful example to each one of us who want to be a Christian. And so let's strive to exhibit that kind of loyalty in our lives as we serve our Master.